was born in England a very long time ago and moved in 1988 to Amsterdam, where together with my partner we ran a very specialized restoration atelier. But my own career, other than the academic part to do with art and design, was concerned very much with fine bookbinding, which was a subject way back in the 50s, and certainly long before then, was considered quite an equal part of studies, the same as most of the crafts. And I will be talking about that briefly. And therefore I learned bookbinding as an artist and designer, not as a craftsperson working in a factory or in a small studio. So my interest has been very much in design bookbinding, which are continued right until the present day. Whilst it's a great honour to be here, there's also something which makes me very nervous, is that just outside the door, I wonder if there are actually lions waiting in the amphitheatre to eat up all those who were given a bad lecture. Let's see. It's certainly a very unusual event to be in the Colosseum of Sofia. Good. Now the title of this lecture you can see here written up, and I will talk a little bit about how it came about, but first of all I will begin with the actual document which you have a translation of. If the speed is okay, that's all right, but if you feel I should speak more slowly or more clearly, please say so. With craft bookbinding, artistic bindings, designer bindings, there are many names for this subject. Still exists in this electronic age is something of a mystery. Clearly, the need for the use of hands, head and heart, combined with a creative spark, has remained a constant factor regardless of the changes going on around us. This applies equally to numerous other creative crafts, such as stained glass, ceramics, calligraphy, and there are many of them, of course, weaving, so on and so forth. But the computer-based book is already with us. I sat next to somebody in the airplane yesterday reading from their Kindle book. It looked awful. Yet the fascination for the handmade codex and its binding continues all over the world. This short lecture concerns the individual hand-bound book, and examples have been chosen to indicate the variety of materials now being used and some technical developments, also the rediscovery and interpretation of traditional forms. So I will now move on to the next bit and see where the lecture actually came from. Creative and artistic bookbinding, what is that? Does it still exist, and where? It does still exist. A lot of people think, and they certainly thought at the end of World War II, that all these sort of subjects were old and out of date, just as the buildings of architecture and so on, that everything had to be new. Anything made by hand was really not interesting anymore. The great mechanical age, as it then was, before the computer age came upon us. But in fact, it has continued nevertheless. And does it exist and where? Now, to give a talk about where and how and what is not easy. You can't suddenly spread all over the world. But I had the good fortune that in Britain, in 2003, the British Society, known as Designer Bookbinders, in conjunction with the Bodleian Library in Oxford, who you all know about, of course, organised their second international bookbinding competition. And using Shakespeare as the theme, participants could choose their own text and language. So the books came from the lands where people lived, they were in their own language, it wasn't a set book. And so many different sizes, shapes, many different titles, but all of them connected with William Shakespeare, who I believe most of you will also have heard of. And this resulted in an entry of more than 200 bindings from at least 30 countries. And they range from Canada to Japan, from Iceland to Argentina. And following this, the touring exhibition of 82 of the bindings is actually now at this moment taking place and has included London, Brussels, Tallinn in Estonia, Pilsen, Weimar, Leipzig, Madrid, Tokyo, and Shika, both in Japan, of course, and ends in April 2015. More up to date, you cannot imagine. And these are the countries which participated in that competition. So fine handmade books are being made by individuals in all these countries. And the kind of interest now being shown, particularly in America and in England, of course, and Britain, but be careful what I say today with the Scottish referendum. It is still Great Britain, for those who don't know. You can see that the prizes, what used to be you paid 10 guineas or 10 pounds for fine binding in the 1950s, you can now have a first prize of 10,000 English pounds. That is a great deal of money. I've never done a binding for 10,000 pounds, but I'm going to relate to it. Okay, so you get some idea of the different countries involved, and they range from all over the world in this case, and include, thinking of Eastern Europe and the history recently, Slovenia and Estonia are there, as well as all the Scandinavian countries, Israel, of course, and South American countries of Argentina, I believe Mexico, but I'm not sure. I think I left one out. Anyway, not to worry. Okay. So these have been selected from this touring exhibition, and there is a catalogue which is available, and I can talk about that later. And it contained all the up-to-date information on this international enthusiasm for this historic craft. And what was very good about the catalogue is that all the entries have been photographed and included in the catalogue. It was impossible to show 200 bindings on the touring exhibition, as you can imagine. So for those, particularly in universities and in museums and libraries and so on, you may find it interesting to have a copy of this book, which is available via the Bodleian Library, and I'll show you that at the end. Good, well I selected 16 bindings, and here's the first one. They're not necessarily the best bindings, or the ones that I like the most. They're ones that are to indicate A, 16 different countries, and B, various sorts of materials that are now considered quite normal for artists, designers and craftsmen using in this subject. Because we all think of old bindings, you know, your minister had one in his hand, bound in calf, I noticed, and very often it's gold tooling, could be in Morocco or in goatskin, as we should say. And that traditional view that fine bindings should be bound in leather or vellum, and the gold tooling is a essential element, is now no longer the case. Book historians, for example, are well aware of the importance of wood for board construction, as in the medieval German blind stamped bindings and earlier ones. There's also a rich history, for example, of embroidered bindings. And wood can be used nowadays as a decorative element or even as a major part of the binding construction itself. And this particular example is the binding called the Solid Globe by Eduardo Gimenez from Spain. This is a splendid example, and it was the second prize winner. And it uses black calfskin, as you can see around the edge, which was the whole binding, and then applied onto it were onlays of dyed maple veneer, maple being a particular tree form. And the lettering insets, as you can see, were actually cut with a laser. So here we are, right up in 2014, with a traditional subject, using techniques and materials which are both traditional and both very modern. Good, eh? I found it quite interesting. Now this makes a very interesting comparison with the next one, which comes from England, because this is also the works of William Shakespeare. Jenny Gray, she is herself a very small lady, extremely talented, and this was one of the very highly thought of books. You can see the collection around the bottom are 40 miniature bindings, very small, about so big, and they're placed into a circular box, which of course is based on the Globe Theatre in London. So these works are all linked together, so you can actually almost hang them up as a kind of necklace, and they don't have to form a circle, they can move about quite well, and you read them from the outside in. They're all proper books with leaves, printed pages that you can read. The material used are linked together in a circular wooden box which is made of maple, mahogany, also with laser edge etching in this time, so you can see that the lettering is inside the board, as it were. below the surface. And the container is an essential part of the design aspect. So not only the books and the construction, but also the theatre itself, if you like to think of it in that way. The tiny bindings themselves are of leather. They are backed with vellum and linked together with nylon beading thread. And it's nice to mention that the construction of everything was carried out by the craftsperson herself. The wood, the etching, the binding, and so on and so forth. We then move on, hopefully, to the next one, which is quite a severe contrast. This one comes from France. Alan Tarral, who actually won the first bookbinding competition with wood veneer that he made fantastic things of. But in this case, this is just an experimental binding that's not meant to be there as a decorative or beautiful design. You can see it's fairly standard and straightforward. But it does make use of aluminium, or aluminum, as I believe they say in America. And it's quite an uncommon material to use for a number of reasons. Obviously, it has a tremendous oxidization characteristic. We don't really know how it handles next to paper over a period of 100 years or so. But he was quite interested in actually the construction and the sort of hinges that were necessary to use. And so it was entered and thought to be worthy of exhibition, particularly because of the character of the thing itself. Very easy to engrave, moving from the last one in wood to this one in aluminium. Okay. Make sure I'm doing right for time. This one, on the other hand, of course, looks very similar in some ways. It's got unusual covers. The title is, I should say, fairly easy to read. It is actually Hamlet. And thinking of where we are, this is a labyrinth. And if you look carefully, you can see that the word Hamlet is actually used in order to create the form. And on the back, the word Shakespeare and Hamlet are also included. Now, this is, of course, from Bruno Maffei in Italy, a young lady, I believe, with A on the end rather than O. My eldest son is called Bruno, so I can work that out. And here, perspex has been used to good effect. And her Coptic style binding, very traditional, of course, sewn in the open Coptic method, uses folded perspex boards with the paper design sandwiched in between the center. In other words, two thicknesses of perspex with the design sandwiched in the middle. And the exposed sewing is obviously an important factor. So already we've had France and Italy, England and Argentina. The next one now comes from Finland, and you can see that the selection has been shown so that we can move fairly easily from one sort of design or one sort of construction to the other. The board on the left is in white. It doesn't show very well, but you can use your imagination and see that it is white, red. And this is actually an interesting construction whereby the book itself snaps shut as though it's a sort of a special case. The spine is actually quite wide, and the construction of the sewing allows it to close as almost like a ledger binding for those who know about that kind of thing. This consists of 3 panels in leather. The roses that you can only just see here are actually made by cutting into the leather, a kurasa technique. Quite common, especially in Estonia and Finland. They used to like traditionally to cut into leather and open it out. And particularly in the west of Europe, before the Second World War, the time of the First Republic of Estonia, for example, almost everybody in Great Britain had a folder or a magazine rack or something in which you had these leather bindings with strips of leather all around the edge and cut leather designs. It was a big export along with bacon and other things. And this, as I mentioned here, the unusual visible method of sewing allows the whole thing is just woven. There is no adhesive used whatsoever. So you do have to open it rather carefully. It's not a book that you use in the kitchen for cooking, for example. And he says himself in the catalogue, a very light mail coat for Macbeth, meaning a suit of armour. So already you can see there are quite a lot of different constructions, an enormous variety of materials. And then we move on now to something which is a bit more easy perhaps to see. This is just paper. Paper bindings and bindings in carton or cardboard are also historically, there are beautiful Italian bindings, very often hidden away, which have been preserved in the 16th and 17th century, which are still almost like new, a bit bent and a bit battered, but the flexible construction of cardboard and carton is something very wonderful. So paper is quite a well-known old material, traditional material, has a long history in the history of bookmaking, and especially for simple and cheap structures. And there's more than one. This one coming up now is by an American, Emily Martin, and she has made a book which is in fact a carousel. You can see by looking at the top that the leaves have been folded from the outside in, so that it opens as a big fan, if you like. And Romeo and Juliet printed on polymer plates, that means for the impression, and the images have been printed on Mohawk superfine paper, which I don't know much about. The covers are of handmade flax, abaca, and linen paper, and are fastened using a unique spine weaving method. And you can see how the flaps make use of the end leaves there also to hold it together. And of course, a castle appears there in a form. Interestingly enough, I believe it is in Slovenia where the turrets very often have this unusual form. So that's our first paper binding. Doing two things at once here, which is quite exciting, really. This is also a paper binding of another sort altogether. And funny enough, I put it on a different page. Never mind. That's my excuses. This group is in this group is from Rose Meridiaan from Belgium. She's covered her book in a multicolored collage. No, that is Claudia Richter, a German binder, has used dark blue Japanese paper, very fine, totally different to the previous one, which was almost cardboard. The design includes cutouts which reveal green neon paper underlays. It has open joints and a dreamy Midsummer Night's feel. Now, by open joints, what it means is that the boards are actually only connected by the sewing, which you can see at the top and in the middle, and further down, the 5 sewing stations. The paper doesn't go over the entire surface like calf bindings or goat or whatever. They are 3 separate components held together by the thread. And very fine, very light, and of course Japanese paper you all know about, and hand dyed by herself. The next one now moves on to Belgium. And this, of course, is quite an interesting one because she has made an actual collage of leather and a recess-dyed Nepalese paper, which she says herself indicates the secret riches of the works of Shakespeare and Goethe. And how this was done, of course, was she made a large sheet of collage, rather like doing a painting, if you like, built it all up into pieces on the background, and then used that as the binding construction, which, of course, gives a beautiful effect. And flying over Europe yesterday, looking down up, I suddenly thought, yeah, it's there beneath us to see in the fields and on the mountains and the vineyards and so on. Okay. Now we move to another technique altogether. Hannah Brown from the United Kingdom. She, in fact, made use of the embroidery or stitched drawing. Now, of course, it is so that drawing is always thought to be by people using a pencil or a silver point or whatever, but we all know ourselves that very often if you're using materials such as leather, drawing with a knife is just as important, and in this case, drawing by stitching. In other words, the stitching is allowed to make its own form, it's not just copied, can give very unusual techniques. And what happens here is she uses a chain-linked stitched full purple leather binding, and it's called Flowers from Shakespeare's Garden, as you can see. It's been illustrated with embroidered flowers and plied over coloured leather onlays. So the leather onlays are placed on first and then stitched all over to make a complete binding. And of course, way back at the time of Elizabeth I of England, 1588 and so on, embroidered bindings were really quite well known amongst the class where people could read and write and have bindings and have books. So that's a very historical amount, and you can see there the kind of result that you've got, together with a rather nice box in this case. And illustrative images, incidentally, you all think of abstract or just patterns, but I mean illustrative images have been used on bookbinding covers from the earliest times. Religious emblems, heraldic, floral elements being the most in evidence. And in the early books, especially the German stamped bindings, for example, saints appear on bindings all over the place. Now, a second one shows quite a different attitude. Almost the same result in some ways. They both use purple, which is quite interesting. I don't know why, but apparently Shakespeare gives rise to the colour purple in people's imagination. Anyway, similar in effect, and using a totally different technique, is the binding by a Japanese bookbinder, Midori Kunikata Cochrane. She now lives in London, is married to an Englishman. Her book, Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. Lamb is a writer, not the sheep in this case. When I was a small boy, I used to see in the library of my father Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, and I always thought it was Lamb's Tales, I didn't know. This is in purple goatskin with hand-dyed onlays and hand-tooled lines. So tooling is here, brought back in, and the cloth composition, as you see, flows across the cover very nicely indeed. What you don't see so quickly is that the leather itself has been dyed so that you can see a dark purple colour, leaves at the bottom there, and the rest slightly stronger purple actually runs through. Very subtle, one might say, not easy to see, but a beautiful book, A, to handle, and B, to admire. Good. The next one is from Poland. We're travelling about quite well. Quite distinctive, fairly obvious. Hamlet, of course, the skull. Alas, my poor friend, or whatever it was he said, I can't remember the actual details. But making use of leather, here, it's a purple-pink goatskin, decorated with ink, transfers, and dark sanded leather onlays. In other words, the leather has been sanded so the original surface has been removed, so you get almost suede mixed with the surface of the leather. That's often used nowadays. People quite like to have this different feel of effect. Tactile as well as real. And as the minister said, to hold a book and to smell it and to feel it is one of the most important parts. You can read it as well, of course. Okay. This was Romeo and Juliet with white goatskin and red goatskin. Oh no, that's the next one. The order I put it. Sorry. This next one, of course, is the first of the real abstract designs, if you like to think of it that way. It is an interesting form of self-expression here, and this is by Sol Rebera from Argentina, who has achieved a very dramatic effect for Romeo and Juliet with white goatskin and red goatskin underlays in this case. The description reads, design based on traditional dress, arabesques of the male-female form, the roads in antique Bologna, which you may know about, some of you, and the whiteness of its buildings, the red of blood, but also of love. And what is interesting in this thing is it's something which is very difficult to do, and those of you that are involved with that, to have underlays of one colour with overlays on the top means that you have to put a very thin red leather on first, and then you put the white leather on top, and the edges are, of course, very sharply cut. One tends to think you can actually sort of just onlay them, which of course is perfectly all right, but this gives you a very interesting three-dimensional effect. Very elegant, very nice, very Italian, I think, if I may say so.
Why not?
Good, got it right so far. Now, we're going to move now back to Estonia, back to Scandinavia, I should say. Estonia is a very interesting country because bookbinding has been a subject there for centuries, and the use of leather is something which is continuous. And they often talk about, everybody can have something in leather because even bears have to be shot in Estonia so many per year in order to keep the balance right. And they've continued and have a very flourishing system there. They also have a designer bookbinders society. They have competitions, they have exhibitions, and they're very enthusiastic. And this is one of the more progressive sorts. This is Shakespeare on the Art of Love, and you can see that it's a kind of double binding, that at the back is the original primary binding, with, you can just see the sewing there, very normal standard construction with firm end leaves, and then it has a wraparound cover which starts just before the spine, moves around, and with cutouts, so that the cutout at the bottom, rather like a window, you can see the sewing there as well. And this, of course, is in it's a visible Coptic sewn binding, been covered in black and white lambskin in this case, very light, and with another wraparound cover incorporating large cutouts. The secondary cover articulates onto the lower board, as you can see, and her design is inspired by the architecture and costume of the ear of Shakespeare, the bard himself. She, incidentally, until recently was the assistant professor, because in Estonia they have an honours degree in leatherwork, which includes bookbinding as a subject. As far as I know, it's the only country in the world which includes bookbinding in its repertoire or program. The next one is by Anna Linssen from the Netherlands, a lady who I don't know very well, but does absolutely superb work. And you can see here that the letter S from Shakespeare has been taken as the original form, just at the top of it. So we have the serif and the thing coming, the form, sorry, coming round. And this consists of, I'm in the right place. The full black goatskin has pierced boards, rather like the previous one. In other words, it goes right through here to the end leaf, and you can see this exposed spine there. Taken from the upper part of the letter S. The edges are lined with multicolored onlaid leather strips. The tooling, that's the titling, is in yellow foil, the lettering spaced to form a rectangular composition. For those of us who know about the style and other Dutch forms of art, Meridiaan and so forth, can appreciate that the Shakespeare has been carefully used as a geometric form and follows in the Dutch tradition of total organization. Those of you that have flown across Holland know that the landscape there is totally different from the one in England, where they just let it grow, or the one here with the vineyards and the landscape have a strong effect. But a very beautiful, quite small book, very elegant indeed, and extremely well done. And what happens is that these onlays actually descend into the book, rather like a series of shelves. Okay, now there is one more. Doing just about right, I think. Because of the association with designer bookbinders, not everybody could be included in the competition. For example, my partner, Katinka Coast, was one of the judges for this. So obviously I couldn't put a book in and win first prize. That would have looked a little bit odd. On the other hand, I was offered the opportunity. They said, well, you can certainly put a book in and pay the entry fee, but you don't come in for the prizes. And so I said, okay, I've got a book which is the Poems and Sonnets of Shakespeare, and I'll put that in. So I thought, just to end up, those of you that don't know me, this is one of my own bindings, and this is the Poems and Sonnets of Shakespeare, and it's bound in terracotta brown goatskin. It's a natural skin, it's not a printed pattern or anything. You can see the grain quite easily, something I'm very keen on. Boards are sculptured before the leather is put on, so there's a curve here, and you can see the curve underneath, and the same at the back. The leather then gets put on and moulded in, and then the feathered onlays, the leather prepared very thin indeed, of yellow, white and black goatskin, and then the tooling finally appearing there. And my idea was that all the loose elements of the sonnets and the building up of ideas gradually come through as a sort of pen. You all know the kind of pen that was used in the time of Shakespeare, goose feathers and that sort of thing. You've probably, in restoring books, come across what look like fingernail cuttings, and they're very often actually pieces of quill where the writer or calligrapher sharpening his fountain pen, should we say. So this was my personal contribution to this magnificent touring exhibition of contemporary bindings. Now, of course, this is only 16 bindings out of 200, and the 60 countries you saw. But this should give you some idea that A, traditional materials are still being used, traditional techniques are still being used, construction is still traditional. On the other hand, the opportunities for using practically anything you can think of. If you go back to the French, for example, the period before the war, where they used eggshells, where they used sandpaper, all sorts of skins of different animals, snake skin and so on. But the opportunities, if the, should we say, creative skill is there, is available. Where is it being done? All over the world, certainly in Europe, and actually it is alive and well. Now, what I've put here now is just the exhibition catalogue, which I've actually brought with me. If anybody wants to see it, there are all the entries are in there. If you make a note of that, the Bodleian Bookshop.co.uk. It's alright, it's not a concert in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, so we're alright. And you can also buy it through Amazon and other internet outlets. And for those of you that want it for a reference, it's actually a very important document of what's happening literally in the world today with handmade books. So, in conclusion, you can see my nerves have gone a bit there. The clearly creative artistic bookbinding is alive and well, almost everywhere. Thank you very much for your attention.